Welcome to Friday. You made it. Many of you here today see the cloud as a huge opportunity to save, modernize, and innovate. However, you may be challenged by requirements calling out for isolation and control, which may slow you down in this journey. My name is Ziv Rafalovic. I'm with the Azure Compute team. And today, we'll see how Microsoft is supporting you to overcome such challenges with the Azure Dedicated Hosts. You may be blocked by your CISO asking you to guarantee that critical assets are not to be hosted on servers shared by any other customers. However, at the same time, you wish to benefit from the comprehensive security, privacy, and compliance and protection offered by Azure. You may be running a legacy application, having the license agreement itself forcing you to run it on dedicated hardware. In other cases, imagine your mission-critical application, which can't be taken down, can't take any interruption during business hours, no matter the impact. Or even a gaming platform where even 10 seconds pause for the VM means game over. When it comes to cost saving, you are looking to bring your own licenses to the cloud and save while doing so. This applies to subscription-based offers and even to older perpetual offers. Azure Dedicated Host is a new Azure service that enables you to run your organization's Linux and Windows virtual machines on a single tenant physical server. It is a new offer currently in a public preview. By the way, we're looking to GA this offer later this month. Note that the Azure Dedicated Host is not a bare metal offer. You can't change the hypervisor, and there is no direct access to the host operating system. Beside the basic promise of isolation, with Azure Dedicated Host, you can select which host to use for your workload by selecting the CPU vendor and generation for your host. You can pick and choose the VM series most optimized for your workload using the same menu found elsewhere in Azure. Those VMs are offered using the same surfaced API. So existing deployment engines or scripts will continue to work with just a minimal modification. With the Azure Dedicated Host, you can control the maintenance initiated by the Azure platform, picking the time, sequence, and cadence for such events. We have introduced two new resource types to the Azure Resource Manager, a host group and a host. You start by creating a host group, specify a name and a region. Next, you provision your host, your dedicated host, in that group, adding the host SKU. Finally, you can use those dedicated hosts when provisioning virtual machines by specifying the host for your VM. Let's see how easy it is to provision a host group, host, and a VM using the Azure portal. So I'm starting by creating a new host group. Picking a resource group I just created, giving it a name, picking a region. I'll skip the rest for now and just go create the host group. A host group is nothing more than a group for your host. You don't really, you're not being charged for that host group. The deployment in progress will count to 10 and then continue. All right, done. Then I'm going to provision a dedicated host in my newly created host group. I specify the same resource group, call it my host. It will be better to pick the same region. I pick the SKU. Let's go with a DSV3 family. You'll learn more about it in a second. Okay? And then pick the group, my group, and skip the rest. So now I've just provisioned a dedicated host capable of hosting DSV3 virtual machines. Let's give it 10 more seconds and then go and try to use this dedicated host to provision a virtual machine. By the way, you can orchestrate everything, the host group, host, and the virtual machine within a single ARM template. In this case, we're making this more of an interactive demo, then I just have to wait. Now I go and create a Linux server. We'll go to the same resource group. By the way, this is not mandatory. You can pick any resource group you want. My VM. I do want to go to the same region. And in the Advanced tab, you can see that now I have an option to pick my dedicated host. So I will pick my group. And within my group, I have only one host, which I will use for this virtual machine. Validate. There is a tiny warning here. We will ignore it for now and let it go. So we've just created, using the Azure portal, a host group, a single host, and we used that single host to create a virtual machine. By the way, if you noticed, I've used a very small virtual machine. It doesn't matter because the host can fit all of the DSV3 family members. If I quickly turn back and look at my host, actually, look at all the resources we just created. So it will take it a few more seconds, but you can see the group and the host already there. And within a few seconds, we'll get some more resources. Let's skip this one and get back to our deck. Let's spend 2 minutes talking about high availability. So in order to achieve high availability, you want to have multiple instances of your virtual machine running on 2 different hosts and have those isolated. So with Azure, you can achieve high availability for your application by placing your dedicated host across multiple availability zones. The level of isolation provides you with this level of isolation help you with both physical and logical protection from failures to power, cooling, network, and even the Azure control plane. By the way, all of the maintenance operation that Azure will initiate will take the availability zones into account and stage any rollout, one zone and then the other. In regions where availability zones are not supported, you may use the fault domain for your isolation. You set a fault domain count at your group and then specify for each of your dedicated hosts a separate fault domain. those fault domains are mapped to physical racks within our data center. You can also combine availability zones and fault domains when creating your host groups and hosts. Sounds complicated? Let's see how all of this plays out using an Azure ARM template. Now let's go from here. Oh, I forgot to switch, sorry. OK, so one of the getting started templates is the VM on dedicated host template. This is a pretty neat template, and I'd like to spend a minute going over several of the aspects of that template. Just zoom in. So, for example, one trick is, one trick is the ability to create multiple resources within a single template. If you look at the copy section here, this is where I'm trying to create multiple host groups. And the multiple host group, I just specify the copy section and indicate a count property. The second trick here is to use a conditional parameter. In this example, the way to read it is the number of host groups to create will be if the parameter number of zones is 0, then set it to 1. Otherwise, use the parameter being used. This is a cool way to make conditional and if statements within your ARM template. Another example, this is where I actually go and create a host. And you can see that the name I assign for the host is a combination of the host, the number of zones, and the number of fault domains, as well as the index. So if you think of it, I'm creating the host calling host 10, 11, 12 in zone 1, host 20, 21, 22 in zone 2, and so on. I highly recommend you take a look at this template. Deploying it to Azure, directly from the Azure template gallery, will bring me to the portal where I just need to specify a few more parameters, such as the host group, the number of zones I want to use, the number of hosts per zone, number of fault domains, and some prefix for the host group and the host, as well as the SKU. So in this example, we're still in US East 2. We'll pick our resource group. And let's say that we want to spread our hosts across 2 zones and 2 fault domains in each zone, having 2 hosts per zone, expecting a total of 4 dedicated hosts of type DSV3 type 1. I click agree and let it go. So these are the resources we created in our previous sample. I'm just expecting to see more host groups and dedicated hosts in this. Actually, we can just wait or keep going. Let's give it 10 more seconds. Whoops, deployment failed because Probably I ran out of capacity. Let's just keep going. I mentioned already a host SKU. So this SKU represents the VM series as well as the hardware type. By GA, we will support multiple VM families. The DSV3 family, the ESV3, it's a memory optimized. We will also support the DASV4 and EASV4 running the new AMD hardware. We will be supporting the LSV2, which is the storage optimized, and also the MSV2, which is our largest virtual machine, offering you a virtual machine of with up to 12 terabytes of memory. The hardware type is mapped to the CPU model itself. So, for example, with the DSV3 family, we already offer two types. Type 1 will be based on an Intel Broadwell processor, offering up to 64 virtual CPUs, while Type 2 is based on the Intel Skylake processor, offering a bigger machine with 72 virtual CPUs. So it all boils down to what VM family you want to use for your dedicated host and how big or new you want your hardware to be. Also, keep in mind that you can mix and match different VM sizes from the same family on a single host. For example, with a single DSV3 Type 1 host, with those 64 virtual CPUs, you can have 1 D32, 4 D4, and 8 D2s. At any given time, you can go to the portal and see what's the available capacity in your host. For example, when you just provision a dedicated host, you can put 1 D64 VM, 2 D32s, 4 D16, going this way all the way to 32 2 vCPU VMs, the D2s. And you can, again, mix and match those VM sizes as long as they are from the same family. Why is this good? Imagine you have your database running on a 32 vCPUs, but you still want your application server to be running on smaller machines. So we've seen customers taking this pattern and taking half of the host itself for the database, and then many, many smaller VMs for the application tier. If I just quickly switch to the host we created earlier, you can see that my host has a single virtual machine. The VM count shows 1. And if I click it, I'll see the VM itself. But that VM was very small. So if I look at the remaining capacity, from 32, I can now have just 31 D2s. But guess what? I can no longer use this host for the D64. I can still use it, by the way, for the D48. So we kind of calculate the remaining capacity for each of your hosts at runtime. Let's talk about pricing. So you are charged for a dedicated host regardless of how many virtual machines are created. In other words, if you spawn a new dedicated host or 5 and you're not using them, you are still paying for them. Keep that in mind. At the same time, virtual machines on your dedicated host will not be charged. You will still be able to see them, the compute hours, in your monthly statement, but those will be charged as 0. Software licenses and storage are charged separately, just like elsewhere in Azure. By the way, I keep mentioning the DS and the ES and the LS families. S stands for the support for premium storage. It doesn't mean you have to use premium storage. So on a DS host, you can still use traditional, slow, cheap hard drives. The price for the dedicated host is based on the VM family and type, meaning EV3 host will probably cost more than a DV3, which will cost more than an FV2. And as you may expect, the type 2 will probably cost more than the type 1. By the way, at the bottom here, you can see the pricing page, and we will introduce, by the end of the month, a new pricing calculator to help you understand and calculate the expected cost for your infrastructure. We will also bring reserved instances for dedicated hosts with a similar 1 year and 3 years term, just like elsewhere in Azure. Again, this all coming this month, later this month. I mentioned cost saving for licensing. So with the Azure Hybrid Benefits, AHB, or AHUB, you can actually license the host itself, not the VM, for Windows and SQL. Later on this session, we'll show you the value that this offer has. Stay tuned. Before that, I want to talk about the lifecycle of your dedicated host. So the lifecycle is maintained separately from the lifecycle of the hosted virtual machines. In other words, you may set alerts on your dedicated host and get those notifications without really any impact to the virtual machine. An under investigation state is a transient one where Azure senses something is wrong or about to go wrong and is trying to identify the root cause. However, a pending deallocated state is an unrecoverable state where Azure realized that the host is beyond recovery. Here's where you have two options set by the auto replace on failure host setting. In the default behavior, where this flag is set to true, Azure will heal your dedicated host by replacing the underlying hardware and will move all of the virtual machines to the new hardware. This is similar to how service healing is done elsewhere in Azure. So your virtual machines will experience downtime, and the asset ID property of the host will reflect that change. So when you look at your dedicated host, you have a host name and you have an asset ID. The asset ID is actually a representation of the physical server ID. So a host healing will result in your host changing its own underlying asset ID. By the way, if you want to track your physical assets, you can use this physical asset ID as an indication mapping to the actual physical hardware in our data center. Once all the virtual machines were moved away from this pending deallocated host, either automatically or manually by you, the host will move to the deallocated. This is like the evacuated state. You are no longer charged for this host, and it is safe to delete it. So it is up to you whether you want full control of this healing experience. Let's say that you believe that you know best when it's time to heal the VMs. You can take control of that. We mentioned the maintenance that Azure runs on the infrastructure. Usually this means we're rolling out new code fixing bugs, rolling out new capabilities, optimizing, adding telemetry, and so on and so forth. We acknowledge that those maintenance initiated by Azure impact your application availability. Again, we mentioned mission-critical applications, such as databases and gaming servers. Each blip is impactful, even for just more than 1 second. While we invest in reducing the impact of those maintenance initiated by Azure, we also offer you control over those blips. In other words, with Azure Dedicated Host, you can create a maintenance configuration, apply the maintenance configuration to your dedicated host, and by doing so, we exclude you from the regular maintenance rollouts and give you 35 days of a maintenance window. So within those 35 days, you can query for a state, and you can apply the maintenance at the host level. And again, this maintenance does not have to result in reboots. It could just be a pause for 5 or 15 seconds. So this helps. Again, imagine a gaming platform customer, right? They can hardly take 2 minutes pause, not to mention 15. So with this kind of capabilities, we kind of acknowledge that those pauses will occur, but at least we give the customer control. And as I mentioned, we keep investing in reducing those, hopefully to a bare minimum. Let's see how this maintenance is surfaced using the Azure portal and the CLI. So before going to the maintenance experience itself, I want to show you the Azure CLI to manage your dedicated host. Okay. A simple command to create a host group, create a host. This is the existing familiar VM creation. All we do here is to add the pointers to the host and the host group. And then we create a maintenance configuration. Associate this configuration with your host. This is basically where you tell Azure, I want to control your maintenance. And starting now, Azure will offer you the 35 days maintenance window. And then you can query, check for updates. You can query to see which maintenance operations are pending for my host. Let's run this. And you can see that for my dedicated host, Azure has a pending maintenance. Now again, this is we just issued this for the purpose of this demo. So you can see that the impact is currently set to 0, and the impact type is none. The impact type may be either pause or reboot. And you may decide to take different actions based on the impact type and the expected duration. Could be that if the duration is less than 5 seconds, you may ignore it and let us run it. Or if the impact is a reboot, you may want to do it at the end of the month or the week and so on. So with that, when you feel comfortable, you can just go and apply maintenance on your dedicated host. I want to quickly show you the portal experience for this one. Actually, what I'll do is, since this is still in preview, I will have to use a flag. And again, the flag will be removed later this month. So those flags are our way to control preview features from interrupting other customers. I'll just find my subscription. So this is another host in a different subscription. And as you can see, there is a new option here called maintenance. And once I click it, Azure will reflect the same information that we've seen from the API. So there is no estimated impact. Again, this is a fake maintenance wave. But what I can see is that I have time until the 6th of December. I have 28 days left in my maintenance window. You can do the math and figure out we started this maintenance last week. All right, so with this, what I can do is, you see the apply maintenance now? I can just click this or schedule this, or use Azure functions to schedule this during the weekend. Okay, so it doesn't mean that this maintenance control has to be interactive. It could be interactive if I have an active standby deployment and I want to apply maintenance first to the standby system. It could be interactive if I want to apply this to all of my hosts at the same time, or I need 4 hours between each host. But otherwise, I can just schedule this using something like Azure Functions, or wait a bit more, and we will introduce those schedule out of the box. I'll take questions at the end. Okay. Okay, so we've seen an interactive experience using the portal or the CLI to create one host and place one VM in that host. But what if you really have to use dedicated hosts, but you don't want to manage them? It's just an additional overhead. What if you have hundreds of VMs to place on those dedicated hosts? Again, imagine a company deploying a gaming platform. So it's a very elastic. They don't really care about each VM placing it to a specific host. They just want the capability. And in another case, we're working with a partner to deploy remote desktops. So again, it's a remote desktop solution to a customer who requires isolation. Imagine public sector, government, and so on. But they don't really want to manage dedicated hosts. So I'll start by saying that we've just started with the dedicated host journey. And we're working to add those implicit placement capabilities into the offer. By the way, we currently do not support VM scale set. We're working on adding that as well. Stay tuned. But in the meantime, we came up with a sample called Dedicated Host Manager, and you can download it from the link here, which basically take care of the host lifecycle itself. It will provision the host for you, find the best host for your virtual machine, and if required, add more hosts to your group. Also, when you delete a VM, it will identify the point where that was the last VM departing from the host and actually go and delete the host itself. So we wrote this code and released this code for you to use. We also give you an option to deploy this code as an Azure function, so that you can take an existing script and just do an invoke URL and just ask this function to deploy the host for you. I'll show you an example of how one can use this function. So this logic actually is written in C# and available for you to download. And in this case, we just package it as this Ignite Dedicated Host Manager function. And we also introduced a test function, again, available for you, where I just want to show you how simple it gets. It's a simple HTTP trigger function with basically two functions, one to provision a VM, the other is to delete a VM. And it just shows the power of Azure Functions as a mean for orchestration. So come on. All right. So this is the test VM creation. And you can see it just takes very few parameters. The name of your resource group, the name of your host group, how many VMs and what VM size you want to use. It will translate the VM size and figure out which host can support this VM. Then it will scan all of the hosts under that host group and find the best host for those VMs. And if none, if some are found, it will use those. If none is found, it will automatically provision new hosts for you. So in this example, I'm asking for 3 VMs of type D32. D32 is 32 vCPUs. Basically, this is like a half a host. So what I expect is that 2 hosts will be created for those virtual machines. Let's give it a try. And again, the function itself, actually, let me start. And by the way, if the previous one failed, I guess I just ran out of capacity with all of those demos. We'll see. So with this function, if you have a deployment engine or a script written in CLI, PowerShell, or just code, you can just replace the VM creation call with a call to this function. We've tried this with a partner. They were using a C# deployment engine using the Azure SDK, and basically asked them to replace 3 lines of codes, and they were able to deploy the same virtual machines on dedicated hosts. So take a look. The code is there. It's an easy way to deploy. There are some settings. You need a service principal, for example, because you want to grant this function access. Or by the way, you can use manage service identity. And from there on, it's up to you. And again, the message here is we want to support customers who just want to use the feature, want to use the benefits without really getting into the VM assignment. If you think of it, it's more of it's almost like playing Tetris. I have a host, I have small VM, large VMs, medium VM, small VMs, large VMs, and how do I pack those in the best way to save costs? I guess this is still working. Yeah, kind of running. I'll skip this one. We'll revisit it later if we have time. Again, dedicated host manager. It's under the Azure sample GitHub. Take a look. All right, we mentioned the Azure hybrid benefits. And this is small, but when you go and provision a dedicated host, you have an option to say, I want to save money. No, you're not seeing this. Yeah, OK. So under Save Money, you can tell us that you have existing licenses. You want to bring your own license at the host level. And then you can apply it to Windows and SQL. You can apply it to Windows Server Data Center Edition. And you can apply it to SQL, either Standard or Enterprise Edition. So what does it mean? The Azure hybrid benefits on dedicated host give you 3 benefits. The first, on the left, is what we call the unlimited virtualization benefit. Meaning, when you license the host, we will license the physical cores used on that host. I'll repeat that, or I'll rephrase. Instead of licensing virtual machines and virtual CPUs, we're going to license the physical cores. At the same time, as you evaluate and try your journey to the cloud, your Azure migration, you can run the same licenses on-prem and in the cloud side by side using the same licenses for 180 days. And also, since I mentioned the cores themselves, you basically license the server and we count the physical cores, we actually don't charge you for the overhead that we take. Meaning, when you look at the Azure Dedicated Host page, you will be able to see how many physical cores are there on each host type and how many are available for you. Azure takes some overhead for overhead, let me call it this way, and we won't charge you for those when you license the dedicated host for Windows and SQL. I want to show you an example what it actually means. So we're going back to the DSV3 Type 1 host, which is a 64 vCPU host actually running on 40 physical cores. So if you do the math, it's a 1 to 2. You actually get to use just 32 of those physical cores. So in option 1, you license the host itself for Windows Server Data Center Edition, and we will just charge you 32 licenses. In option number 2, actually I'll zoom in, it's a bit small. In option number 2, you charge each VM. And when doing so, we basically add 8 licenses or any multiplication of 8 for each VM. So if you are using your dedicated host for just one D64 server, we are talking about 50% cost saving when you license the host. If instead you use the same host for 16 4 vCPU smaller VMs, the D4, you're actually saving 75%. Because the way to see it is like 16 times 8, not times 4. All right, so this is, especially with smaller VMs, this is a big difference. Okay, so keep that in mind. When you have your software assurance, it comes with the Azure Hybrid benefit. And if you're going all into the cloud, do the math. There is an Excel here, which kind of compares the option. The way to look at this Excel is basically you specify the host settings. How many small VMs I have, large VMs. It will do the math itself and show you the benefits. The same principles apply to SQL. Sorry, for some reason I have the slide hidden. The same Excel works on SQL as well, either Enterprise or Standard Edition. The benefit is more towards the Enterprise, and especially if you're using many small SQL VMs, like a 4 CPU SQL server, this is a big saving. All right. So we discussed use cases for Azure Dedicated Host. We mentioned isolation. We mentioned control. We mentioned cost saving. Then we showed how to use those using Azure Dedicated Host, Portal, CLI, PowerShell, SDK. We showed how to control the maintenance using the Portal as well as CLI. We showed how to handle large deployments using the Dedicated Host Manager utility, and then showed the benefits with the Azure Hybrid benefits on Dedicated Host. So again, just to recap, we're going to GA by the end of this month. It is currently in public preview in all regions. We're going to add more families, more hardware types. You've heard the AMD announcement. It's already there. Soon you'll see next generation hardware, larger VMs, and so on and so forth. So I hope this kind of convinced you to give Azure Dedicated Host a try. And I'll be here for the next few minutes. If you have questions, just approach me. And with that, I wish you enjoy the rest of the week. Have a short, safe trip home, and thank you so much.